Hi there. This is our third session of Job, and hopefully it's going to be the final session for us. We left off last time with that beautiful declaration that Job made in chapter 19. And he says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me." What a fantastic statement. I mean, Job is, in the midst of all his pain and suffering, you get to see who Job is in his heart. You get to see that despite all of this, he comes out with something this amazing, this beautiful, and also with this kind of insight. It shows that he's a great man of faith and he's a great man of character. Okay, so after that, his theology is slowly changing. His view of God, it's still not quite there, but we'll get to see that he does get there. But his friends, unfortunately, they are still as awful as ever. And if we go down to verse 29 in that chapter as well, we see that it reads, "This is the portion from God for a wicked man, the heritage appointed to him by God." He's presuming that Job is wicked. And he's also presuming God's judgment on him because of that. Not so good. Not exactly supportive, are they? And then we go down again to, this just continues, unfortunately. We go down to Eliphaz the Temanite again in chapter 22. And in verse 5 he says, "Is not your wickedness great, and your iniquity without end?" Wow, isn't that crazy? It's not true, but he's assuming that it must be. That's why these things are happening to Job. So, yeah, obviously their theology is wildly wrong as well. And then it's really interesting that later on in chapter, 23. In chapter 23, it's very interesting. Job is starting to answer and he's starting to talk a little bit more. And it's pretty amazing some of the things he says. In chapter 23, verse 11, he says, "My foot has held fast to his steps." He's talking about God. "I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food." Wow. Again, in the midst of it all, we're seeing these beautiful declarations, these beautiful things which really show what Job's all about. He treasures God's word more than his necessary food. That's quite incredible. How many of us can say that? Then in chapter 24, we get to see the heart of the question that's really haunting Job in all of these discussions, or in all of this. And it says in the New King James, it says, "Since times are not hidden from the Almighty, why do those who know him see not his days?" In the NIV it says, "Why does the Almighty not set times for judgment? Why must those who know him look in vain for such days?" And in the NLT says, "Why doesn't the Almighty bring the wicked to judgment? Why must the godly wait for him in vain?" So Job's saying, hey, what's going on here? I'm not seeing that the wicked are brought to judgment. And in fact, I'm probably seeing, he's obviously feeling the opposite. But that's a question that's haunting him. He's saying, okay, when does God bring justice and judgment upon the earth? Because he believes in his heart, and he actually is right. He hasn't knowingly done anything. But he's still not, he still hasn't really got it. And we're going to see later on that God makes it very clear, and then he totally gets it. And then later on, in chapter 26, his friends are still accusing him. His friends have basically completely misdiagnosed what's going on here. They're still accusing Job and saying that he's wicked. And then Job's sort of saying, hang on, guys, are you really speaking for God? Or is this something that's coming from yourselves? And what he says is, he says, verse 20 in chapter 26, verse 2, how have you helped him who is without power? Have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? And how have you declared sound advice to many? To whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit came from you? That's very interesting, because some of them are alluding to a spirit guiding them. And it's like Job saying, yeah, but whose? Because it seems plain to Job, but it's not God's. And in fact, as we read it, it's plain it's not God's either. And then Job continues in the same chapter. At verse 13, he says, by his spirit he adorned the heavens. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Indeed, these are the mere edges of his ways, and how small a whisper we hear of him. Isn't that beautiful? But the thunder of his power, who can understand? God is so awesome and so amazing. Do you really think, guys, that you can speak on his behalf? And I see this quite often. I might have mentioned it on one of the previous sessions, but I see that people attribute certain qualities or whatever to God in terms of, they say, oh, if I was God, I would never act like that. I would never say that, or I would never do that. That's absolutely bonkers, as we're about to see as well. But it's so crazy to assume you have the same level of understanding that God does. I mean, we are nothing, particularly compared to God. It's a joke. It's not even, it's sad more than anything else, I think. How can we understand? Our understanding and God's understanding are completely and utterly different. His is so high above ours. As it says, our thoughts are not his thoughts. Our ways are not his ways. He is so far above us that we can't even comprehend the small things, the simple things. But that's what Job's saying to his friends, basically. He's saying, God is awesome and amazing. Really? You think you're speaking for him? And then they start talking about wisdom. In chapter 28, and then in verse 12 it says, but where can wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. This is Job. And then we get down to verse 23, and this is interesting. God understands its way, and he knows its place. And verse 28 it says, and to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. He's basically saying, look guys, thanks for your input, but you don't know God's wisdom, because God is so awesome, so powerful, so mighty, that fear of the Lord is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. And then in chapter 29, he goes on to say, hey guys, I'm sorry, if we're going to be honest here, and I've had enough basically of you fellas, you're accusing me falsely, and God will be my vindication, which actually is what turns out what happens. And then a very interesting one that we get in chapter 31. Job's still struggling. He's not really talking to his friends anymore, but he's still struggling with God. And in verse 6 he says, God, Let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. It's not as if God doesn't know already. But unfortunately, he still thinks that God's putting him through all this and that it's not the enemy. So in chapter 32, we get a young fellow coming in who's all upset and caught into it too. And basically what he's doing, he's angry with the elders that have gone before him, that they haven't nailed Job down somehow. And he's defending God against Job's accusations, which he doesn't really need to do. And then in verse 13, it says, why do you contend with him? For he does not give an accounting of any of his words. For God may speak in one way or in another, yet man does not perceive it. In a dream, in the vision of a night, when deep sleep falls upon men, while slumbering on their beds. Which is true. But is it really relevant right now for Job? And as if we needed more evidence, in chapter 36, we've got Elihu again, who's saying to Job, bear with me, in verse 2, it says, bear with me a little, and I will show you that there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. Elihu, seriously? You're presuming to speak on God's behalf? Oh my goodness. But hey, it's not long. He's going to get a little wake-up call. I think Job's friends, they meant well, but they completely did not get it. They didn't, like Job, they had a works-based theology and they did not understand. And what surprises me too, in some ways, I suppose, is they didn't seek God. They didn't ask God for understanding for what was happening to Job. That seems like kind of an obvious thing to do, but maybe it's also part of the times as well. Like we're so blessed and we're so lucky because we have the Holy Spirit within us. So therefore we can come near to God at any time. Back in those days, it was not like that at all. They didn't have the Bible. They didn't have the Bible and they didn't have the Holy Spirit within them. So it was a lot more difficult to hear from God in those days. Okay, here we go. Now we're finally down to it. After all the stuff that's been going on and the friends accusing Job and Job trying to defend himself and being grumpy with God, finally God turns up. And this is what we get. And this is, obviously amazing. In chapter 38, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Another translation says, by ignorant words. He's telling Job, he's speaking about stuff he's no knowledge or insight about. Never mind understanding what's going on. Then God asked Job a series of questions just for Job's sake to show how little he knows and how little he understands, that he doesn't even know the right questions, never mind any answers. And so God says to Job in verse 3, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you and you will answer me. So I think with this first question that God gives to Job, it's kind of like, poof, it's a complete knockout punch. You don't recover from this. But God, in his mercy, goes on just to explain more fully to Job how little he knows. But this first one, I think, is just, it's spot on. It's like, okay, I can't really answer that. So in verse 4, God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Boom. That's it, really. Game over. But God goes on to explain a little bit more. So Job really gets the full picture of how little he understands. And then I think there's this amazing bit in verse 7 that says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Isn't it amazing? It's God's talking about the time of creation when he created the heavens and the earth. The morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. I think that's kind of just blows my mind. You can read it, of course, and it's beautiful. Some of the things that God's describing and explaining, and even nowadays, some of them we have no clue about. I mean, honestly, if God said to any of us, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? We'd all have to go, I'm with Job. No clue. We were not here, obviously. We don't even understand the questions. And then God goes on to describe in verse 31, which is, he's talking about the stars now. Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? It's like, I don't even know where they are, God, never mind bind them or loose them. And then in verse 36, which I think is a very interesting, particularly related to Job and his friends, it says, who has put wisdom in the mind or has given understanding to the heart? Fascinating, that. Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven? It's incredible. So one of the things whenever I was going through Job that was challenging to me was the question, we all asked us, why God? Why? And frankly, I think I've pretty much stopped asking God that question, because I've kind of come to the realization, if God in his mercy and grace or kindness actually gave us an answer, if he gave us a full answer, I really don't think we would understand. I don't think we have the ability to understand everything that's going on in the background in our lives. I mean, goodness, we don't even know the number of our hairs on our head, which is basic stuff. So we don't even understand the inner workings, I think, a lot of the time of our minds, and also we can't remember, well, at least I can't. Maybe you can, but I can't remember a lot of the stuff that happened in my past. Well, obviously I can't remember, in vivid detail everything that's happened to me, but God knows all of that, and he knows how it's affected and shaped us. So therefore, to ask why, God might give us a simple answer sometimes, but it's, cut down to size so it's manageable for us and gives us some sort of understanding, I think. But really, I think if God was to explain why, most of the time we wouldn't have a clue. We totally wouldn't understand the why. So for me, it's just like, okay, God, I know I'm not probably going to understand the why now, this side of heaven. Then I will. But Lord, I trust you. I love you. I know that you are completely and incredibly faithful. So I'll leave the why to you. I know he's trying to make me more like Christ, make me more like him. So that's what gives me hope, shall we say, or confidence.
Okay, so we're getting to the crux of Job now. We're in chapter 40. I'm going to read this out in this first part in a couple of different versions because we want to see exactly what's going on here. So we go from the New Living Translation first, or the NLT. Job 40. Then the Lord said to Job, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic, but do you have the answers? Then Job replied to the Lord, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. There you go. But the King James Version, surprisingly, is, well, not surprisingly, is a better translation at this stage. It says, "Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it." Then Job answered the Lord and said, "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth." Now that whenever in verse 4 where Job says, "Behold, I am vile," in the Hebrew that word vile means despicable, awful, deserving of hatred and contempt, but suddenly I think Job suddenly got it. Compared to God, he has no righteousness whatsoever. And also compared to God and how magnificent God is and how glorious God is, he's vile. So I think he's getting it here. And then God goes on and talks to Job, and there's a couple of things he has to say to him. And in verse 8 it says, "Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you yourself might be justified?" The NLT says it like this: "Will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove that you are right?" God's asking this of Job. Yeah, so this is kind of like a judicial view of God. It's not based on God's grace, which the book of Job is all about. The book of Job is all about God's grace, because God's amazing grace is poured out on Job at the end. And also, Job knows at this stage, I am vile. He knows he needs God's favor. He knows he needs a mediator. He knows he's never going to be righteous enough. And he also knows that he needs a redeemer. He knows he's going to get all those things and that God is actually going to give it to him. So he's aware of God's grace, which is God's unmerited favor to give us something that we don't deserve. That's what grace is. Whereas at this stage, he's still got this bit of judicial view of God in terms of if he does something wrong, unless he's done something wrong specifically, he doesn't deserve whatever it is. Whereas in Romans, Paul very clearly says, there is none good, no, not one. Nobody is good. That without God, we all inherently under condemnation. It says in John 3:16, it says, John 3:17, the verse after, it says that if you do not accept Jesus, you are condemned already, because that's the state that we are born into. So Job is still a little confused there, but I think he's getting there. So he's basing it on his works and his merit. At least he was. So God's pointing this out to Job, I think. I think that's will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove that you are right? So God's saying this to Job. So God's pointing out that Job has had a flawed view of God, that he's been looking at God through a very judicial system, not realizing that he totally deserves the worst, apart from God's grace. And of course, this is why, and then God's grace, God's unmerited favor on Job's life means that he has a mediator, he has a redeemer, and he is going to be righteous in God's sight. And then I think we get to chapter 42, which is the last chapter in Job. And I'm just going to read the whole thing out because it's pretty great for Job. Then Job answered the Lord and said, because it's also important from Job's perspective, his heart is changed. "I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand." See, he's getting it. "Things too wonderful for me, which I didn't know." Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job gets it. And in verse 7, and so it was, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is aroused against you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Interesting, isn't it? Now therefore, take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go up to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. See, God's repeating it twice. He's saying, you haven't spoken of my character or who I am. Whereas Job is right. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamite went and did as the Lord commanded them, for the Lord had accepted Job. And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Interesting. I'm sure there's a bit of forgiveness on there too. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then all his brothers, his sisters, and all those who had been his acquaintances before came to him and ate food with him in his house. And they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. Sorry, I think they just missed that little part there. The Lord had brought the adversity upon him. He had allowed it, but he did not bring it upon him. It was the enemy that brought the adversity upon him. Each one gave him a piece of silver and each a ring of gold. Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He's a very wealthy man. So he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the name of the third Keren-Happuch. Interesting names. In all the land there were found no woman as beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brother. Now that part is really interesting. That was never ever done in the whole Old Testament days. You didn't give an inheritance to the female parts of the family. It just didn't happen, but Job did. I find that really interesting. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died old and full of days. And that's Job. Interesting. He went through a lot, Job did, but I think he learned a lot as well, and I'm sure, I am certain, that his heart was softer and more humble before God at his second part of his life than in his first part because of what he'd gone through. Yeah, it'll be interesting. We'll be able to ask him in heaven, hopefully. Anyway, thanks for that. That was Job. It was a little bit more surface level than what we normally do, but I hope you enjoyed it all the same. Leave comments, ask questions. Thanks very much.